The worst thing you can do to your plant is to pot it up into soil or compost. I've been growing over 200 plants in my home for about 10 years now, but when I was just starting out and noob settings were dialed to 11, I was slowly killing them by potting them up into compost that I had in the garden. Plants love compost in the garden, right? So why not bring it in and use it for our indoor plants? It's thrifty too.
Well, the first problem we run into is drainage. Drainage is the be-all and end-all for plants. Without it, they're on a one-way ticket to Binville. Soil or compost is tightly packed, which means there are very little air pockets, so when it gets wet, it turns into a cloggy mess. If you have delicate plant roots in there, then it's a disaster waiting to happen. A disaster called root rot.
For example, I once had a pothos that was a thriving beauty until I repotted it into a dense compost mix I got from the garden. Within a couple of weeks, the leaves started yellowing and the plant wilted despite being watered sparingly. When I checked the roots, they were black and mushy from root rot. That's when I realised the roots were suffocating the roots. There just wasn't enough airflow in the mix.
You see, root rot isn't just about the water. I know we often talk about the evils of overwatering our indoor plants, but water is only part of the story. The real killer is oxygen, or a lack of oxygen. Plant roots need oxygen just as much as you and me, and when they are deprived, they are far more susceptible to root-munching bacteria having a dinner party at their expense. Bacteria kills the roots, they turn black and mushy, and before long, we need to say a prayer for our beloved dearly departed plants. Just look at the state of this. This is wet compost, and as you can see, it's pretty claggy. You wouldn't like to have your toes permanently in that, would you? And neither would your plant. All of this is much more of a problem for us indoor plant folks because the natural drying processes are much slower compared to the great outdoors with all that sun and all those wind changes, etc.
By the way, diagnosing all your common plant problems like yellowing leaves, wilting, leaf drop and many more is made so much easier with my free plant troubleshooting handbook you can download for free with the link in the description. Now, there are other issues with soil and compost for your plants that I'll enlighten you with in a sec. But first, what can we do about this soil drainage issue? I mean, what are we supposed to be using instead? Well, don't get me wrong, you still can use soil and compost, although I wouldn't really recommend it, as you'll see in a sec. But you'll definitely have to lighten it up to artificially inseminate those air pockets.
The gold standard in this case is perlite. If you've not come across perlite before, then you're missing out, my plant friend. Or should I say your plants are missing out.
Perlite is a lightweight, white, volcanic rock that has been heated until it expands to become as light as a feather. It's this lightness that makes it valuable in the plant world, because water runs through it like it isn't there.
So pop this in your mix and water doesn't linger around like a fart in an elevator anymore. Then there are other bits and pieces like bark, sand and vermiculite, and they all serve the same purpose, to create air pockets in your soil mix so we don't suffocate the roots. Vermiculite is a bit different though because it retains more water than perlite, so one to keep an eye on.
How much of these ingredients you will add will largely depend on what you are growing. Pretty much all tropical plants will benefit from a ratio of about 30% perlite and 70% compost. No need to get your weighing scales out, of course, an approximation will be just fine.
If we are potting up succulents and cacti, plants that are naturally arid dwellers that live in rocky soils, then a mix of something like 1/3 perlite, 1/3 compost and 1/3 sand would be just the ticket. Bark or bits of coconut husks are great for aroids like monstera, philodendron and alocasia because they really do love a lot of air around their private parts, and the chunkier the soil, the better.
In all honesty though, I would just ditch the compost or soil entirely and opt for something else, because even with these additives we still run the risk of it being too heavy for our little green misters. When I learned of my compost potting mistakes, I started adding perlite to my mix, but I still had issues that I'll show you in a bit.
So what's the best alternative then? Well, I'm a big fan of coconut coir, and it's something that is used more often than not in potting mixes these days. Coconut coir is a natural fibre made from the outer husk of coconuts. It helps retain moisture, but is also excellent at providing good drainage and aeration for roots.
I know I've banged on about drainage so far in this video, but water retention is still important because you do want your potting mix to still hold on to moisture. Pop your plant in just sand, for example, and he's probably not going to be happy, not unless you're really on top of your watering.
I switched to Cybotanica's pre-made mixes a couple of years ago, and it was one of the best things I've ever done. My plants are now singing my praises. Well, they're not dying anyway, which is a boon. Their mixes have no compost or soil and are instead primarily made up of coconut core and perlite with coconut husks and sand added depending on what mix you get for what plant. And you can see this with the bag it comes in because they come airtight. No holes in the bag, which is a feature of soil mixes containing decomposing compost that needs to let off some steam.
That leads me neatly onto the next reason you really want to avoid compost or soil indoors: mould. This is something I used to see far more on my plants when I was using compost compared to when I switched to Cybotanica's mixes, and why I've turned my back on compost completely. There was always a layer of white mould on top of the soil, and looking back it was pretty gross.
Thank God the dog days are over. The problem is that compost is rich in organic matter. Great outdoors of course, all those beneficial bacteria turning broken down bits of garden material into nutrients for the plants to munch on. Indoors though, that organic material becomes a playground for fungi to thrive. Moisture, warmth and a lack of airflow allows compost to hold on to too much water, creating the perfect breeding ground for mould.
Fungi isn't all that bad really. It helps turn compost even more composty, but when it's all cooped up indoors, it grows much faster due to the lack of air and the higher moisture content. If you see lots of fungus on your soil, it's a sign that your soil is staying too wet for too long. And it's something I just don't see with coconut core.
Now I should mention one of coconut core's major drawbacks, the fact that it is inert. It doesn't break down or decompose or hold on to nutrients in the same way compost does, so you do need to be on top of your fertiliser game. Forget to add fertiliser to the water you give your little green friends often and they're going to suffer.
Now, what's the single most annoying thing about having a few plants dotted around your home? Let me know down below. Is it the constant need to water, the repotting, the mess it creates, the complaining?
Nope. All of that pales into insignificance when compared to a mighty plague that impacts every single plant parent at some point on their green journey. Yep, gnats. Those annoying little gits that seem to be drawn to your head while watching TV on an evening like a moth is attracted to a flame. In fact, while I'm sat here writing this very video, I've had 2 fly at my nose already in the space of an hour. If you're not familiar, then fungus gnats are little flea-like creatures that turn up at your plant's front door, barges in uninvited and starts making babies in the bedroom within minutes. The cheek! They're like squatters I guess, but worse. As their name suggests, the reason they love turning our plant soil into a dog in paradise is fungus. And where is fungus plentiful? Compost.
Seriously, my gnat problem was off the scale a few years ago. Those sticky yellow traps were filling up at an alarming rate and I was pulling my hair out. That's why I've got none left. I moaned about it on the channel and the feedback was that it was because of the compost I was using. Since switching to a coconut core mix, the problem has thankfully gone down. It's still there of course. They'll always be with me, but there is less of them at least.
The fungus in the compost and the slow rate it dries out is absolutely perfect for gnats to make hay. And they did. Fungus gnats lay eggs in moist soil, their larvae feed on fungus, and then the gnat emerges to wreak havoc in your home. The larvae even munch on tender roots, so your young plants are at risk too. The crux of it is that they don't breed well in lighter, faster drying mixes like coconut core. And by the way, if you are struggling against the gnat army, then I do recommend beneficial nematodes. They're not as creepy as they sound, and they do wonders to wipe out a gnat population fast, until the next one invades of course. But at least you do get some respite for a couple of months at least. Anyway, I made a video all about it you can check out in the top right corner.
Another way to get away from all this fungi, mould and gnat malarkey completely is to ditch soil, compost and coconut core altogether. Yep, it turns out plants don't need all that stuff anyway. As long as you nail the nutrients, they'll happily live in water or semi-hydroponically.
Leca is lots of plant folks' favourite. I've got a few plants in it myself these days. There are pros and cons to leca, and to be honest, I've not yet decided if I prefer it to potting soil or not. I mean, it's great that it's a gnat and mould deterrent, but it's also a bit of a faff.
You need to clean your balls before you use it, and then you have to keep on top of washing them to stop salts and whatnot building up.
And I know tons of people swear by it in terms of growth, but I've not really noticed anything spectacular with my plants. And then, all that water lying around your home is just waiting for a mozzie or two to come and join the party. Luckily though, that's not yet happened to me.
And the transition from soil to leca is a bit of a hell-raising moment for our green mister. Get it wrong and you could be saying goodbye prematurely.
Perlite is another great semi-hydro option, but the problem here is algae. Water, light and white rocks is the perfect breeding ground for algae to take over. I don't think it does much harm, but it sure does look ugly. I've got this Ficus elastica ruby that's spent his entire life living in just perlite, and he's looking like a handsome fellow if I do say so myself.
These semi-hydro options like leca and perlite do rely on you being extra diligent with your fertiliser. You can't just add normal Miracle-Gro to the water because apparently the roots won't be able to take it on board. It needs to be specifically formulated for water, like the semi-hydroponic houseplant focus I use on my guys.
Fertiliser is a bit of a funny thing, truth be told. Miracle-Gro gets a bit of a bad rep for being synthetic and thus the work of the devil, but it's really not that bad. It's horrible when it gets on your hands, sure, but for a quick fix to wake a plant up, it's actually probably more effective than your posh organic one with your plant responding quicker to it.
I explain why this is the case in this video here, so make sure you check it out and I'll see you there.